I'm delighted to welcome a distinguished group of scholars here today to address the question of hemispherical relations, and particularly North American relations in the Trump era. Mistrust thy neighbor, U.S.-Mexico-Canada relations in the age of Trump. To my immediate right is Andrew Seeley. He is president of the Nonpartisan Migration Policy Institute and an Andrew Carnegie Fellow. You have their full bios here, so I'm just going to introduce them briefly from the stage. Next to Andrew is John Shields, who is a professor in the Department of Politics and Public Administration at Ryerson University in Toronto, Canada. And then finally, at the end of the line, only metaphorically, or actually only actually, not metaphorically, is Desmond Arias, who is the Marx Chair in Western Hemisphere Affairs here at the Marx School. So there's a lot to talk about, from migration to trade to security issues, and I wonder if I could just ask each one of you briefly to sum up what you see as the salient differences in the North American relationship since January 20th of 2017. What's changed? What kinds of dynamics do you see at play, and how should we shape this conversation this morning? And Andrew, I'm going to give you first spot.
I wrote a book that came out right after President Trump took office called Vanishing Frontiers, The Forces Driving Mexico and the United States Together. And people keep saying to me, that title is meant to be ironic, right? But I would argue to you that, in fact, what is different is that we are living a moment where there's an enormous pushback against our two neighbors. But in reality, we're getting closer than ever before. And so there's the first time we are obscuring what actually is going on, which in fact is we're getting closer with our neighbors in a way we never have before. I mean, this has been a long-term process, but there is sort of a pushback because we got very close very quickly, particularly with Mexico, more than with Canada. You know, though for the first time we're fighting with Canada openly, right? I mean, but generally speaking, the Mexico is the more salient and the more difficult relationship. We became what I call intimate strangers. We're intimately engaged, and at the same time we don't know each other very well, and so that's created a pushback. And so just an example of this. So, Trump comes into office, he immediately says we're going to pull out of NAFTA, we're going to build a wall on the border. 3 months later, the U.S., Mexico, and Canada announced that we're doing a joint World Cup, right? That we're going to host, soccer's the biggest sports event in the world other than the Olympics. We're going to host it together. What's disjuncture going on here, right? It turns out we had negotiating NAFTA, but we end up coming up with a NAFTA that looks almost exactly the same, and we can talk about that later if you want. There are some differences, but largely the same. I call it, if anyone's been to Tijuana, if you've ever seen the painted donkeys that are called zonkies. They're made to look like a zebra, right? But everyone knows they're really a donkey. That's the new NAFTA, right? We call it something else. We say, it's great for the American worker, but it's largely the same thing. Largely because what we have in NAFTA is not a trade agreement. We trade with China, we trade with the EU, we trade with lots of places in the world. In North America, we actually make things together. I mean, NAFTA is actually a production agreement, not a trade agreement. There's a lot of trade that goes on, but literally half of the trade in NAFTA is trade within industries. Okay, because we're making things together, cars being the biggest, but appliances and technology and all sorts of things that we're actually making together across the three countries. It was very painful getting there. I'm not going to say that NAFTA was perfect. One could question at the time whether it was the right thing to do, and reasonable people could disagree on whether, what they should have looked like and could we have made this easier. But 25, 30 years later, what we have is three deeply integrated economies. And the reason why we ended up with a NAFTA that's very similar to the old NAFTA is, as they started to negotiate, they realized you can't pull this apart anymore. I mean, we now actually make things across the three countries. We're economically integrated. We invest across the three countries. But it's not just, and with this I'll conclude, it's not just economics among the three countries. I mean, it is also, if anyone watched the Oscars on Sunday, hands in the air? Okay. 5 of the last 6 people that have won the Oscar for Best Director are Mexican. 5 of the last 6, okay? Something is going on. So Vanishing Frontiers, I have a chapter on film, actually, which was the most fun to write, because I knew nothing about it when I started, and I got to watch films, which was really fun. And I got to take my wife to watch films, so it was very good, very fun, actually. But there is something going. What I found as I was looking at that is that, in fact, has been an integration going on between the Mexican film industry, which was very creative already, and Hollywood, because we're neighbors, right? I mean, by the way, does anyone know how many Canadians have won the Oscar for Best Director? I have no clue. Okay? I thought of looking that up on the way here. I said, it doesn't really matter. We won't even ask that question, right? How many of the actors and actresses that were nominated were Canadian? I have no idea. We don't even ask that question, right? I mean, this is something where it is so natural. If someone is Canadian or American, the number of people that you suddenly discover are Canadians who live in the United States, you kind of don't even bat an eye, right? That's the kind of relationship we have with Canada. It is a much more fluid relationship, which is why we all sort of chuckle a little bit when Trump goes after Trudeau, because it seems so funny. Because this is an intimate relationship that's intimate, where we actually do sort of know each other. With Mexico, we still pay attention. It still is, it is still something we notice. But increasingly, not only are we economically tied, but in lots of things, and we can talk more about this, whether it's sports, the World Cup, but also, by the way, the NFL, Major League Baseball, NBA, all play games, regular season games in Mexico. I didn't actually realize this till the end of writing this book, by the way. All of them, I knew in football, but it turns out the NBA and Major League Baseball play in Mexico as well. I mean, there are all sorts of things, food, obviously. I mean, there are all sorts of connections we have on the cultural side as well. We're increasingly becoming 3 deeply integrated countries, yet at the same time, there are some real differences, and we can go into this further. There are some real differences, there are some inequalities, and there's some adjustments going on in this relationship. And I think part of Trump's appealing to this sort of anti-Mexico and then surprisingly occasionally anti-Canada, bent, and it's finding an echo in the American public, is that it does speak to still some of that discomfort we have in coming together with our neighbors. And coming together with the world more broadly, for which Mexico is often a metaphor, Canada less so. But there is some adjustment still going on, but I think what we're seeing is sort of the last pushback as we continue to grow closer.
Okay, and we will, a little bit later on, try to get somebody to identify at least 5 of the #1 single Canadians, but that will be later.
Yeah.
There are lots of those. So, John, Canada newly visible from the sometimes blinkered perspective of the United States, not necessarily the subject of chuckles north of the border.
No.
Can you talk about what this looks like from your perch in Toronto?
Well, we like to be invisible because this is a bit of a elephant and mouse type of relationship. And when the United States looks at Canada, especially Mr. Trump, this can be a problem because the relationships actually since the election of Trump, and the big difference is the election of Trump, has been a bit of a roller coaster. Soon after Trump was elected, Trudeau came to Washington, and they actually got along quite well. Trudeau more than survived the handshake challenge.
Yes.
And also, Trump was praising the Canadian immigration system, talking about the need for a skills-based system like the system that Canada has. I think if you looked at it more closely, there's actually a lot more to it, and I think you'd be less enamored with it, because Canada and the U.S. are actually moving in quite different directions.
Yes.
Around the immigration system. But nonetheless, it started off quite positively. Then, of course, we got to trade. And then things began to come apart, and there was a lot more tensions. Of course, that began with the build-up to the NAFTA negotiations and the imposition of tariffs on steel and aluminum. And then through, of course, the NAFTA negotiations, where the American side really did try to pressure Canada in various ways to accept new provisions in the agreement that were not in Canada's interest to accept. And Canada, I think, actually played hardball because they realized that the United States actually, or Trump actually needed the agreement. So I guess I would call it sort of defensive defiance on the part of the Canadians. And in the end, they actually gave up very little, really, and preserved the most important parts of the agreement that was important for Canada. And Canada certainly, as was mentioned, the economies of Canada and the U.S. are very integrated, and more so after NAFTA. Over 74% of trade that Canada does is with the United States. The U.S. also is quite dependent upon Canadian trade, not to the same extent, of course, but 15% of U.S. trade is with Canada. Canada, up until 2016, was the U.S.'s largest trading partner. It was surpassed in 2016 by China, very slightly. But the only reason that happened is because the price of oil fell so dramatically. Once oil rebounds, Canada will once again become the largest U.S. trading partner. The economies are so intertwined, and the supply chains so developed on a continental basis now. Really, they can't be undone without a lot of damage. So in the end, I totally agree. NAFTA 1 looks very much like, I'll call it NAFTA 2. Very, very little differences really there in the end. Now, I think there's a lot of continuities and some discontinuities in terms of the relationship. Again, I think the continuities are the trade relations, which are a little strained and people are a bit bruised north of the border. But they realize presidents come and go, and it's a bit of a waiting game on that front. And also, Canada's to some degree sort of vanished from the picture now. The attention has been turned elsewhere, and we're quite happy about that, actually. On the discontinuity front, I think Canada's moving in a very different direction in terms of immigration. It's also moving in terms of broadening its trade relations with the world. If the U.S. has sort of an American first approach, Canada has embraced sort of a progressive kind of trade agenda that is outward looking and more cosmopolitan in its nature. Nonetheless, the ties between Canada and the U.S. remain extremely strong, not just on the economic front, but also on the even the family and interpersonal type of front. I grew up in Windsor, Ontario, which is right across from Detroit, Michigan. I think we're one of the few places in Canada where America is actually north of us because of the way the continent goes there. But that city, there's a lot of ties. There's a lot of family that are on both sides of the border, and that's not uncommon. And of course, our cultures are very similar. A lot of the media that gets or originates in the U.S., of course, crosses the border. Most Canadians live within 100 miles of the U.S. border. And so those ties, remain. So I think, Canadians kind of look with a little bit of a sense of bemusement and wonder at what is going on south of the border and prefer to become a little bit more invisible again.
That's a sentiment that you might find on this side of the border as well. But Desmond, from your perspective, what are the major continuities? What are the major discontinuities? And what do we do with a newly visible Canadian relationship? How does that progress from here?
Well, I would say that, so I was listening to what Andrew said, and I think that in terms of the drug trade and security issues, we've sort of always been there on sort of denying the truth, right? That on one level we say, hey, Mexico, Central America have these problems, and it's incredibly violent, and it's different, and we need to do something to address it. But at the same time, we're consuming the drugs in the United States. We are part of the supply, the value chains that are bringing those drugs up to the United States. So the United States, for a long time, has said sort of Mexico's different, Colombia's different, if we want to go even further south of the southern U.S. border. But, we've always been part of those communities of consumption, right, and communities of production of drugs, right, and Americans are very much participants in that. So, the sort of the two-directional, the observation that Andrew makes about sort of things going in both directions definitely is happening and has been happening in terms of drugs and security. What's sort of remarkable is that this rhetoric has become even more acute since Trump came to office, where you have the president talking about bad hombres coming up from Latin America, or putting out an entire White House press release on members of the Mara Salvatrucha Trece being animals, and repeating the word animals multiple times in the document, and it all being posted on the White House website. So, I mean, it's become even more dramatic and more stark, this denial of this regional integration between the United States and Mexico in terms of the illicit trade, which has been quite robust over the years, and in fact has been supported by the growth in illicit trade, right? You said more trucks across the border with cars or dishwashers in them. It's that much easier for more trucks to come across the border with cocaine and marijuana and heroin in them. And so as legitimate trade has grown, illicit trade has grown between Mexico and the United States. And the more the United States has, over the last 20 years, promoted integration and promoted trade, that's also promoted illicit trade, right? So one of the reasons, though certainly not the only reason, why the drug trade is so robust in Mexico, and in particular, why why Mexico has become a critical cocaine transshipment hub into the United States, is in part because of how much the United States and Mexico have invested in creating this economic superhighway between the two countries, right? Part of that is, fun and exciting things like television sets and vacuum cleaners and dishwashers. Part of it is even more exciting things like cocaine, heroin, and marijuana, depending on your perspective on these things. So all of this has sort of been distilled under Trump into this idea of a major security rhetorically, of a major security threat to the United States. And the administration has this, this idea that, we can build a wall to prevent the entry of these products, which the United States government at the same time is making a huge effort to be sure can flow rapidly and efficiently through border crossings, right? And, if you're talking about the drug trade, this isn't stuff that for the most part is coming across in backpacks through the Sonoran Desert, right? It's loaded up on trucks and driven through, or it's, you find a town in Mexico near the border and you dig a tunnel underneath it and people come up in a safe house in San Diego and the drugs are in the United States. But this is stuff that's moving for the most part directly through where a wall would be, and with, the oversight of the United States, often the ineffective oversight. But if you're interested in having a robust trade, you cannot stop every single vehicle to make sure that there are no illicit products in it.
Let's continue on this theme, if we could, of integration. And I wonder if we could break it up this way. If we could think first in terms of trade, which all of you have mentioned to some degree. Second, in terms of people, very much including migration and particularly refugees. And I'd love, John, to hear a little bit more about Canada's refugee policy, which is so starkly different from what we have here in the United States. But then also identity, a kind of hemispheric identity, a kind of self-presentation among the members of this bloc to other potential multilateral and singleton nation trading partners in the world. But let's start with this question of trade. So you've all pointed out that trade is inherently integrated. It has been since NAFTA. That has accelerated over time. We've seen differential impacts. We've seen reduced manufacturing activity in Canada. In the United States, initially reduced manufacturing activity, taking off on an upward trajectory again after 2006, and a sharply increased trajectory in Mexico. Yet that hasn't been a great deal, at least that I've been able to see, of the policy conversation here in the United States, leading from NAFTA to the USMCA. I wonder if you could all talk about the small scale of the changes, but also what those changes were supposed to create in making that new agreement. And John, why don't we start with you?
Well, I think for Canada, the big issue in the negotiations was to get a dispute, to retain the dispute resolution mechanisms.
Not dairy cows.
Not dairy cows.
Okay.
In fact, what happened in terms of dairy was that the U.S. in the end got a minor concession from Canada, which is 3.6% access. which if you actually look at it with a Trans-Pacific partnership arrangement, they were going to get 3.5% anyway,
Right.
until they had pulled out. So it's a very, very minor sort of move in that regard. They did get some additional access to some of the other agricultural products like chickens and so forth. But in the end, I mean, the dairy farmers weren't happy, of course. But there's less than 12,000 dairy farmers in Canada. So this isn't a lot of people, actually. But Canada, wants a way to be able to sort of protect itself from unfair tariffs and so forth. And so they need a dispute resolution mechanism that's going to have a fair sort of a process and an independent arbitrator making those final types of decisions. So that was absolutely crucial for Canada. I don't think it would have signed the deal without that. And so that was a major concession on the part of the U.S. Canada was also very concerned with autos. Much of the manufacturing that goes back and forth is autos, auto parts, and so forth. And in the agreement, there are some limits in terms of how much can be exported across the border, but Canada's well within those boundaries, so it's not really going to affect us. Canada was also very much engaged in the initial part of the NAFTA discussions around increasing some of the wage rates in the auto sector in Mexico. And now 45% of manufacturing of autos in Mexico have to be $16 and above. So Canada actually was part of that sort of push. So the auto workers in Canada were quite happy with that type of arrangement. So it sort of preserves our auto component, although we did just lose 3,000 jobs in Oshawa. And of course, the United States also lost jobs in various states that are still going to Mexico because it is, in many respects, still cheaper to produce in Mexico because of wages and benefits and other sorts of factors. So this has obviously been a concern, but it does provide us a strong degree of protection that's going to ensure that still there's a significant amount of production that is retained in Canada. The other thing that was preserved is restrictions in terms of our cultural industries. For the United States, culture is simply a commodity. For Canada, it's about national sovereignty and national identity. And also because, of course, we also have Quebec, which is French language dominated. There's a real sense of urgency that culture becomes one of those areas that have special arrangements and protections. So those clause was preserved within Canada. The other thing I guess we did make some concession on was around patents around pharmaceuticals. So it was extended from an 8-year protection to a 10-year protection. The U.S. still has 12 years. Mm-hmm. So there was a bit of a trade-off on that. But overall, I think Canada sort of preserved the things that it needed to preserve in the agreement. And, it is going to be sort of business as usual in terms of trade between the countries.
Okay. Andrew, John describes from the Canadian perspective what seems to me very much like your Zonky, new paint, but really the same animal underneath. Do you see any ways in which this has fundamentally changed anything? And if not, what rhetorical or political purposes were served in repackaging this agreement and creating the USMCA?
I think there are some new things like energy, electronic commerce, digital commerce that are in the new NAFTA, which were not contemplated back in the early 1990s. There are some more restrictions in the auto industry that make it more managed trade, less free trade, but it's largely the same. But, let me take a step back and say nails matter to us, right? I mean, nails are one of the, I'm thinking, we'd be outside in the cold of New York if it weren't for nails. The largest nail factory in the United States, the only large nail factory in the United States, in southeastern Missouri, a place called Poplar Bluffs. And it is they Mid-Continent Nails, they market under lots of different names, but they're the largest U.S. nail producer. They have survived against mostly Chinese imports. Most nails, 85% of nails in the U.S. are imported mostly from China. They've survived because they get their steel from northern Mexico. They have a plant in northern Mexico that's connected by a rail line. Poplar Bluff is on the old rail line, actually, that goes north up to Chicago. And so they're able to get steel in a way that's competitive. And interestingly enough, Mid-Continent actually was sold to the steel company in Mexico. It's now a Mexican company as of 2013 and has sort of survived because the Mexican steel company was willing to come in and save it at a time when it might be going under and integrate what is the steel production in Mexico with the nail production in the United States. And by the way, this is almost all entirely native-born U.S. workers in Poplar Bluff, Missouri. There's not much of an immigrant community, much less from Mexico. I think I managed to meet all the Mexicans that live in Poplar Bluff when I was there, actually. This is also, nails is sort of a niche, but this is the auto industry. The auto industry in the United States, for those of us old enough to remember the 1980s, we all knew we were all going to be driving imported cars, right? At some point, we thought we were all going to be driving Nissans and Toyotas, and if you're lucky, a Mercedes. And some of us do, by the way, except that it turns out almost all of those are made in North America now. Almost all. It's very hard to buy an imported car in the United States. Even if you think it's imported, chances are it was actually made in North America. And most of the value add was done in the United States. Probably the final assembly was done in the US. About 60%, 57% of final assembly is done in the United States. A little bit's done in Canada, a little bit's done in Mexico. But value added, it's almost 2/3 is actually still made in the United States, right? But Mexico and Canada are a big piece of the auto industry. We do not have a U.S. auto industry anymore. We have a North American auto industry. Part of why, there were several things that happened that made the auto industry competitive in North America, but one of them is being able to outsource some of this production to Mexico, United States, Canada, to distribute it across 3 countries. So in the end, even if you're driving a Nissan or a Toyota or a Mercedes or a BMW, chances are it's actually made in North America. Chances are it is not an imported car or a Kia or whatever you want. Almost all of these foreign car companies, instead of making cars elsewhere and sending them to the United States, make them in North America. Okay? This is what integration did. I mean, it actually allowed North American industry to survive. Now, the nail plant. One of the things I found out when I was looking at the nail plant, actually, which is a great story, right? Saves American jobs. Nail plant has expanded. Now it's contracted a little bit because of steel tariffs, but it expands. It's a great news story about integration. I've been talking to the CEO of the Mexican company that bought this, and he said, but the first day I showed up, I met the workers and I told them how we had just bought the company and we're going to expand it, and they're all looking at me like I'm about to fire them. Because this was one of the most hostile audiences. This is not the kind of audience I'm used to talking to. This is a CEO who's used to, talks to his workers and they all cheer and, these guys are just staring at him. And he's going to pink slip us. It turns out it was not irrational. There was an air conditioning plant around the corner from the nail plant, which had closed down and moved to exactly the same place in Mexico where he has his headquarters, right? And so there are lots of cases of this where this has happened. I can tell you lots of American industries saved by integration with Mexico and Canada, and yes, that's true. But there also are lots of Mexican companies and Canadian companies that were put out of business by bigger U.S. companies. There are lots of jobs that were moved from the United States to Mexico, particularly early on, still happens. There's lots of restructuring going on, and I think we need to understand that though we have done well in a macro sense, on average, we're doing pretty well in terms of economics in the United States. Human beings don't actually live on averages. Human beings live with real wages, with real jobs. Some people have done better than others. Right. And with globalization, we've actually ended up okay. The United States has done pretty well, if you look on average, but different workers have done differently in globalization. And so NAFTA, or the USMCA, which I guess is the new term, or Mexico and Canada, more Mexico than Canada, becomes shorthand for whatever you feel has happened in your own fate, right? And for some people, that's great, right? Some people, this has been a real good news story of wages going up and industries being saved. But for some people, it has meant, yes, maybe the industry was saved, but if you're not a professional worker, your salary has remained more or less flat over this time. And so part of, I think, what we're talking about when we talk about North America is a shorthand often for larger economic issues that we're dealing with in American society as we deal with globalization. And globalization has played out very unevenly for very different people in the United States. And it matters whether you're in the nail plant or you're in the air conditioning plant, right? And it matters whether you are the worker whose job was saved because you're an assembly plant in Tennessee, or you got a job at a Nissan plant because Nissan decided to come to Tennessee. I think it's Nissan that's in Tennessee or Toyota, I wonder, or both, I can't remember, that have a huge plant there. I mean, that's great, right? Or if you are in one of the auto part companies that decided to move its production to Mexico or decided to move to Windsor. I mean, your life depends on, your perception of the neighbors depends a lot on your shorthand for globalization.
Desmond, I wonder if you could flesh this out in the context of at least two things. One is the U.S. political impact of these changes. If there's anger on the part of the base because they perceive that NAFTA, to use Ross Perot's inimitable line, that giant sucking sound of jobs headed south, does USMCA alleviate that anxiety at all, noting the difficulties of separating that from tariff activities that really have nothing to do precisely with USMCA? And how does this position any of the North American partners vis-a-vis TPP or other trade agreements that are both being developed and have long been extant?
So I think with regards to the political base for Trump being anxious and fearful, I don't know if anything's going to resolve that, up to and including building a full-scale wall along the entirety of the southern border. I think that there's a lot of political anxiety in the United States that's associated with factors that are probably beyond the control of any individual administration. It's exacerbated by the fact that the president stokes that anxiety, very often. But people, as Andrew was just saying, people don't live on averages, right? Certain people things have not worked out quite as well for some people as they have for others. There are a lot of dynamics in our society that over the years have promoted growing inequality, right, and concentration of wealth, especially in large cities like New York, and not in places like rural Missouri. And in fact, a lot of what you have happening in, rural America is people leaving, right? And people seeing their towns sort of fall apart as people move to cities in search of opportunities. A history of small holding farms, family farms, in the Midwest and in other regions of the country, is breaking down for a variety of different economic reasons, right? And increasingly, over the past 30 years, family farms have become corporate farms. And, you have large-scale agriculture, and that's sort of and some of those dynamics, right, where the opportunities are located very often in large, dynamic, wealthy cities that concentrate a great deal of cultural and intellectual capital, is at the heart of a lot of this cultural anxiety. Leaving aside the question of migration, which I think also affects things on a certain level because you can see people in your community who might be different from you, and that creates anxiety. But a lot of the anxiety really is about people not living on those average growing GDP, wage stagnation in the United States, and in particular, people leaving certain parts of the country, right? Which is why you have, President Trump being elected with a minority of the popular vote, right? But certain key states where these experiences of deindustrialization, wealth concentration, out-migration to other parts of the country, actually delivering the election to him in the Electoral College, right? So I think that's a real dynamic, and it's important to understand that. I don't think that anxiety is necessarily going anywhere. If it is, it's going to require a rebalancing of a lot of priorities in the United States. I think one of the issues that has come up, I think, in some of the things that John has said, but that we often don't give enough attention to when we talk about bringing jobs to the United States and the effect of the North American Free Trade Agreement and potentially USMCA on the United States, is that while a lot of U.S. manufacturing jobs have flowed to Mexico in search of somewhat cheaper labor, a lot of agricultural jobs in Mexico have disappeared and become concentrated in the United States, where our large-scale corporate agricultural industry is very efficient at producing things like cheap soybeans, cheap corn that becomes tortillas in Mexico, in many cases, though certainly not all. And so the Mexican agricultural industry has had a hard time, while the U.S. agricultural industry has been growing and doing quite well. And so it's interesting when, President Trump and others talk about industrial jobs in the United States, and a lot of this being a focus on industrial jobs. There's a lack of recognition of how we've also traded these agricultural jobs, right? Well, not necessarily agricultural jobs, but at the very least agricultural production, right? And how more of the production is concentrated here, and that's had some effect on, some negative effects on Mexican agriculture, which of course then also drives migration on the part of Mexicans into the United States or into Mexican cities in search of jobs that have been displaced from U.S. factories, right? So there's that shift. And also, some migration of some Mexicans into illicit industries, right? Especially, agricultural producers where, Mexico has certain advantages in production, right? It's easier to grow opium poppies in Mexico than it is to grow opium poppies in the United States. But, I was talking to a colleague recently, who works on heroin producing areas in Mexico, and opioid production in the United States, another type of industrial production, has hurt Mexican opium production, right? So these Mexican opium growers, who were providing all sorts of patronage and services in these communities that they dominated, have fallen on hard times, right? Now, a lot of that illicit opportunity structure in Mexico has flowed into, of course, cocaine transshipment, so they're not as dependent on opium production as they were, and heroin production. But nonetheless, this is another piece of that dynamic. And really, like the United States, Canada, listening to Andrew and John, the United States, Canada, and Mexico are sort of locked in this ongoing interaction where shifts going on in one country are generating shifts in other countries, right? And that is the nature of regional integration. As these things happen, we change each other, right? So we have Mexican auto workers in the United States organizing to increase wages in the auto industry, and that's something that works positively for North American auto workers, not North American, United States auto workers. You have in the United States growing agricultural production, growing opportunities to export agriculture hurts agriculture in Mexico, but then it helps industry in Mexico, right? And the question isn't, with all of these agreements, NAFTA, TPP, isn't so much how are you going to stop this, right? It's how you're going to manage it for the benefit, for global benefits, but also for the benefits of your own population, and in particular populations that have been hurt by the dislocations of previous shifts, right? And what's unfortunate about our discussion in the United States today is how impoverished it is in terms of the real concern of how to manage those real concerns, right? It's about maybe throwing out NAFTA or getting some minor, concession that the president can tweet about, or it's about building a wall rather than developing, more coordinated industrial policy to address the needs of Americans who've very much been hurt by not just shifts in North America, but larger scale global shifts in how industrial production works.
You've talked about some of the misunderstandings about migration, and it seems to me that for all of the heat, there's very little light that's been shed, at least in terms of public discourse. We know with regard to Mexican migration, it's actually down in almost every dimension, whether it's cross-border, legal, fully documented, not something else. And yet people perceive, and the president has, of course, declared a crisis at the border. We don't talk much about the Canadian border. We would think that enterprising bad hombres might just want to take a boat and come back in over the Peace Bridge, but that doesn't seem to be much of a concern for us. Could you talk a little bit about where you see this conversation today and salient differences that will drive policies as a bloc, as we understand one another as three nations in collaboration?
So, U.S. policy, to address migration for a long time has been to promote growth and economic development in Mexico and northern Central America, right, and the Caribbean. If you want less migration, one of the challenges, I'm sure Andrew can speak to this better than I can, is giving people opportunities at home. And NAFTA has actually done that. If you want to talk about Mexican migration declining, one of the reasons why that would decline is there are economic opportunities in Mexico, right? And that is meaningful. Whether or not politicians want us to properly perceive what the real dynamic is on the border. There is the question, of the migration of gangs, right? I think when we talk about the Maras of northern Central America, the Mara Salvatrucha, the Barrio 18, it's important to understand that we actually exported those gangs to Central America, right? They started among migrants from the civil conflicts in Central America, in Los Angeles, and a lot of those guys ended up in prison, and they organized themselves, and then as a result of U.S. policy changes in the 1990s, get deported back to Central America, very often having little education in Spanish, rudimentary ties locally because they'd spent most of their lives or much of their lives in the United States, and now they found themselves back in Central America, and they become the nucleus of these structures that then grow for a host of reasons domestically. Now, the president is, in addition to calling members of these organizations animals, right, has spent a lot of time demonizing these groups, and it's important to recognize that the Mara Salvatrucha and other large-scale criminal enterprises from Central America are in fact dangerous organizations. People join those organizations, especially in Central America, for legitimately complicated reasons. There's not a lot of security. There's not a lot of work opportunities. And for certain types of people in Central America, these are what so many of them perceive as an alternative to protect themselves, for young adolescent men to protect themselves in dangerous neighborhoods, and to, advance different economic interests. And I mean, there are a lot of problems with that, right? But nevertheless, this is, there are complex reasons why this is happening, right? The historic response of the U.S. has been to promote growth and promote democratic governance in these regions in order to minimize some of those stresses. But an important thing to recognize about the gangs, about these gangs, is that the president does spend a tremendous amount of time talking about how these countries are sending to us their worst people. And I don't think that that's really an accurate reflection of, the broader question. But even among gangs, the MS-13 doesn't smuggle people into the country. People migrate to the United States, and the MS-13, which is a transnational gang that started in the United States, recruits them into cliques of those Maras in the United States, that it sets up in the United States, right? So the people who migrate here aren't gang members, but for various reasons, once they're here, the MS-13 is able to recruit some of those people in these communities into gangs. So you can put up whatever barriers you want at the border, but you're not necessarily going to find these people and stop them from coming into the country. They're not sneaking in here, they're coming in here legitimately. But for different reasons, once they're up here, they're being organized into these gangs, right? And a more effective response to this question is, how do you respond to people joining gangs, on Long Island, or in Los Angeles, or in Montgomery County, Maryland?
Okay, thank you. I wonder, John, if you could talk a little bit about the very different approach that Canada takes to migration. Of course, Canada, a much smaller country, roughly 10th the size in terms of population of the United States, but a higher per capita proportion of migrants, and a much different approach to asylum seekers. I believe right now you have more families seeking sponsorship of asylees than you have asylees to resettle. Couldn't be more starkly different either at the national level or in the terms of popular embrace than you find in the United States. Could you talk a little bit about that, please?
Yeah, so immigration really is at the central part of Canadian policy, but in a very different way from that of the U.S. So it's a major sort of driver in Canada in terms of its economic policy. Almost all labor market growth in Canada now is being made up of newcomers coming in to the country. Also, it's a major factor now in terms of trying to address the demographic challenge that we have, which is an aging population. So immigration is seen as very central for this. Canada has moved to a longer-term approach to managing migration and has actually quite dramatically increased the number of immigrants that it's allowing into Canada each year. So by 2021, the goal is for 350,000 immigrants to come and permanently settle within Canada each year. And it seems to be going up by about 10,000 per year. Some have asked for 450,000 per year. So 350,000 actually means about 1% of the Canadian population. So it's quite dramatic. Over a 3-year period, it's about a million people. So this is quite substantive. But it's seen as being absolutely necessary in terms of rejuvenation of the labor market and for trying to address some of the demographic shifts in terms of aging population and the reduction in the ratio of how many old people there are and how many people are in the workforce and how much tax dollars it will pay to support the healthcare system and old age security and so forth. Canada tries to do what it calls a balanced system of immigration. So about 60 to 65% of immigrants are so-called economic migrants, so mostly skilled migrants. 25% roughly is sort of family class. They're coming in for family reunification types of reasons. And about 10 to 15% are humanitarian class. So these are the refugees. And that's a fairly significant proportion. If you look at it on a kind of a global scale, Canada is one of the leaders in terms of welcoming refugees. During the Syrian crisis, Canada brought in about 40,000 Syrian refugees. And it seems they're still doing the analysis on it, but seem to be actually been quite successful in terms of their settlement. Canada actually, in terms of the numbers of refugees coming into the country, sponsored either by government or sponsored through civil society, by 2021 is going to be well over 40,000, which actually will surpass the number that is taken in by the U.S., and we're 1/10 the size. So very dramatic shift. And that's because the U.S. is taking in less and less refugees. One of the problems we've had, I guess, since Trump came to office and his immigration policy is quite a few migrants from the U.S. with unsettled status coming across the border and then claiming refugee protection. So there's been, I'm not sure what the exact number is now, but there's been thousands of people crossing the border. A large number of them were from Haiti and also
Nigeria.
Africa, Nigeria in particular. So that has caused some stresses and strains in terms of the politics of this and also the ability to settle it. Toronto absorbs a lot of these folks in the end, and the city just doesn't have the resources to adequately house these individuals. But Canada is following the rules and giving each of these individuals and families hearings and so forth, and will resettle a good number of them. Some will be deemed that they don't really have legitimate sort of status, and then they'll face possible deportation. Although some may not be able to go back to their home country, so they may in fact land off staying in the country. The other thing I would say is that Canada, unlike the United States, has a lot of supports for newcomers, and this is not just refugees. So we have established settlement programs for language training, for employment, for orientation to the country, seeking assistance in terms of housing and so forth. And the federal government, as well as the provinces now, have been quite active in providing program dollars to nonprofit organizations that administer these programs. So I think for each new immigrant in the country, there's about $3,000 or $4,000 that's sort of set aside for that assistance. In the United States, it's much more of a laissez-faire approach where the government really has a hands-off type of attitude. So the idea is to create a welcoming community for newcomers because they are seen as being so central, and for government to be part of the solution here in terms of providing a good sort of first few years for assisting in that integration.
Andrew, I'd like to get the audience questions, but you've been doing so much good work on migration. I wonder if you could say, just provide us with a capstone here, and also talk about something that we don't often talk about, which is migration into Mexico, particularly from the southern border.
The number of Mexican-born people in the United States dropped from 11.7 million to 11.3 million between 2010 and 2017. That's 7 years. It doesn't sound like much, right? But the number dropped. We're having this debate about building a wall on the border. The number of Mexicans living in the United States has actually dropped in the past 7 years, right? Since 2007, the large-scale migration of Mexicans to the United States, overwhelmingly unauthorized, illegal, undocumented, whatever you want to call it, just hit a wall and slowed down, largely because things in Mexico had changed over time, and then you had a detonating event that stopped people going for a couple of years, the Great Recession, and then they just didn't pick up again. Right, and so the number of Mexicans coming to the United States has gone down. A lot of Mexicans still come to the United States, although fewer than Chinese and Indian immigrants through legal channels. Right, I mean Mexicans are just a little bit behind Chinese and Indians right now, but more Mexicans are going back to Mexico than are coming overall. That is quite shocking, by the way. That is, I mean, we could not have imagined this 10 years ago, right? This is sort of or 15 years ago. I mean, this is still, it still baffles me sometimes that as much as there still is a 4-to-1 difference, a little more than a 4-to-1 difference in wages between the United States and Mexico, you just don't have the magnet you once did for Mexicans to come. You would think more people would do this, and why people go back. I mean, some are being deported, obviously, but most people are going back voluntarily, and that's sort of interesting also. I mean, people are choosing to go back and start over. So this is, and we have a, at the same time the number of Mexicans is going down, you have a large number of people from the United States moving to Mexico. There are between 1 million and 2 million Americans living in Mexico right now, okay? We are their largest immigrant population, by far. About 2% of the Mexican educational system, elementary and middle school education, are U.S. immigrants, okay? Mostly children of Mexican parents in that case, but not exclusively, right? But about 2%. We sat down the other day we have a working group with a Mexican university where we're talking about migration policy. A lot of former policymakers, and we've involved a lot of current people as well. One of the things we discovered is actually how similar the issues that we're dealing with on both sides of the border. So, there is some differences. Mexico still has a large diaspora. You still have those 11 million people in the United States, right, who are Mexican citizens, half of whom are undocumented, which really matters to the Mexican government. And so, it's a different, it matters to the U.S. government. So there's a different relationship. But the largest issues on the table are Central Americans. We'll come to that in just a second. The Central American flow through Mexico to the United States and increasingly staying in Mexico. So trying to figure out what you do about immigration policy, what you do about your asylum system. How do you integrate people into communities that are already where services are already overburdened? Sound familiar, right? How do you integrate people who are, by the way, have never studied in Spanish, which is all of us, all the Americans, right? I mean, even kids whose last name may be Perez or Hernandez, who speak Spanish at home, have never read a book in Spanish before, and suddenly they're in a classroom in Michoacan trying to, and they don't know who Benito Juarez is, they've never studied Mexican history, and suddenly, they're in 4th grade and they have to navigate, they're immigrants. Right? And yes, legally they can actually get Mexican citizenship because if your parent's Mexican, you can legally become a Mexican citizen, but they are immigrants in the same way that a Mexican kid in Las Vegas is an immigrant, right? And so we actually spent a lot of time on integration issues, which we would not have done 20 years ago, by the way, or even 10 years ago. We realized we're dealing with integration challenges in the education system, integration challenges in the labor force in both countries, right? We're dealing with figuring out basic nuts and bolts of immigration policy. So what Mexico is trying to do, I mean, the large number of people, so when we talk about the wall, the large number of people coming across now are Central Americans. Overwhelmingly Guatemalans and Hondurans, overwhelmingly fleeing violence, bad economic situation, sense of desperation of the future. December, there were actually more apprehended at the U.S. border by U.S. authorities, more Guatemalans and Hondurans than Mexicans. By the way, almost impossible to believe that. than 10 years ago. More Guatemalans and Hondurans. These are much smaller countries, really far away, and yet there weren't that many Mexicans. Salvadorans, by the way, are going down also. There are a lot of Salvadorans still, but the Salvadorans, like Mexicans, are going down. Also, age pyramids in both Mexico and El Salvador skew a little bit older. Guatemala and Honduras skew younger. So there's more people in the age of migration. Huge issue that we need to look at is who needs protection and who doesn't. I would say one of the things that we've seen Mexico do increasingly is their asylum system has gotten overwhelmed. So they have a very robust asylum system, but completely backed up by now Central Americans who want to stay in Mexico and seek asylum, and completely backed up, and they're trying to figure out how to fix this. Same thing in the United States. You apply for asylum in the United States, you stay for 3 or 4 years. President Trump is not totally wrong, by the way. It creates a really perverse incentive if you don't have an asylum claim to apply for asylum, because you can stay for 3 or 4 years if you have even a slight asylum. But it turns out to be really unfair to people who have an asylum claim as well, because you also don't know if you're going to get deported back to face the gang member that wants to kill you or rape you or kill your child, and you spend 3 or 4 years going through this complex process. So huge need to figure out, and with that I'll end. But we can talk about this more. Huge need to figure out, not just immigration. We sort of talk about everyone as sort of immigrants. First of all, we talk about everyone as, as a Salvadoran colleague said recently, we were on a panel together, he said, everyone assumes I'm Mexican, right? We talk about sort of unauthorized flows as though everyone's Mexican. He's like, I walk down the street, everyone assumes I'm Mexican. By the way, he lives in Chicago. It's like, we need to differentiate, first of all, Central Americans and Mexicans and Salvadorans from Guatemalans, because there's different dynamics going on. But also we need to begin to differentiate, people who are fleeing from violence for whom, and I've spent some time with some of these, I spent some time the other day with some kids who had all fled really horrific stuff, and this was just at a shelter in Tijuana. Really horrific things. Some people are really fleeing for their lives, who deserve protection from people who are fleeing for economic reasons. We should be treating them differently. I'm sympathetic to both, by the way, but chances are we shouldn't be encouraging people to leave their countries and come to the United States for economic reasons. We can't actually accommodate that right now in our system, but we should be giving protection to other people. Oh, and finally, sorry, but let me add one more thing on the Canadian model. I do suspect also in the United States, we may end up having to learn from Canada. Oh, yeah. And as much as it seems like we're going a different direction, I think we actually may end up there, which is, the other side is, we also shouldn't assume that, what Canada does is actually manage migration. Canada actually sets national priorities around migration. You don't set national priorities. Right now the debate is between those who don't like immigrants and think that they're taking our jobs and maybe leading to gangs, and those who think that we're treating immigrants badly. At some point we actually have to have a different debate, which is, what is our national interest around immigration? I think one of the things we're going to discover is 2/3 to 3/4 of our permanent legal residents come through family categories. That's great in some ways because of the laissez-faire nature of our system. Family networks help, but it's probably not the smartest way to do it. We probably do have to think in terms of what the Canadians do in work-based immigration. We probably do have to think about, do we do high-skilled, middle-skilled, low-skilled? We probably need all of those, but what's the mix? We do need to think again about our refugee and asylum programs. We need, and then we do have to have some immigration control around this, right? Part of what works in Canada is, Canadians are very discreet about this, but they do enforce their laws also. And so, they create lots of pathways that are legal, which much more than we do, much more intentionally, but they also do enforce that, which is why when you have 500 people coming illegally from the United States into Canada, it creates a national crisis. Right? In a month, 500, at one point, literally, the Canadian official said, we had 500 people last month. This is a crisis for us. And this was a private conversation. I will not say who it was, but a very senior Canadian official, and I started laughing, unintentionally, but I started laughing. I said, you have to understand, right, 500 is sort of a city in the United States, right? That's like Laredo. You know Laredo. That's not even Tijuana, San Diego. That's like a little, blip here. But for Canada, the credibility issue matters. And so we do also, those of us that are sympathetic to immigration, that think it matters for our future, that think that we actually need immigration for our workforce needs, we also do have to be attentive to the fact that if we can fix our system, we better enforce it as well.
Okay. So I'd like you to please join me in thanking our panelists for a terrific conversation.